The rain turned the city into a smear of light and shadow, a watercolor of headlights and umbrellas that blurred the edges of everything Emma thought she owned. She stood in the doorway of the Cedar house, with the carved key heavy in her palm, fingers tracing the tiny scales cut into brass as if the pattern could teach her steadiness. The scent rose out of the wood, warm, resinous, a private perfume that made her shoulders loosen in a way her parties never did. He had given it to her like a promise wrapped in grain and knot, a place to lock herself away from the urgent economy of appearances. Noah had leveled the gesture with the kind of intimacy reserved for anniversaries and transactions. He arrived carrying a plant and a smile that seemed composed at the same pitch as his voice. There was a choreography to the exchange. Holding the door, letting the cedar air wash around them, a small remark about how the house was exactly her size. Friends would later remark on the ease of it, on how natural he looked leaning over the mantel, discussing wallpaper as if wallpaper were the solution to any ache. Emma, who had learned to wear approval like a bracelet, took the house and the look he gave her. It felt like settling. She began to lay claim in small domestic ways. A brass key with the scale motif went on a worn bowl beside the front door. A cedar sachet tucked into the linen closet made the sheets smell as if they had been wrapped in late summer. She bought a short lamp with an opaque globe that offered a softened light for the living room. At night, it washed the room in honey. The social life continued at its usual polite pace, cocktail shadows and the squeal of heels down the marble stair, and the house became a stage on which the softer machinery of permanence might run. She liked the steadiness of routines, the kettle before noon, a ledger kept on her nightstand where she made small inventories of days in ink. The first oddness was small enough to be explained. A pair of pearl earrings she had left in a velvet box on the dressing table did not answer when she reached for them before a dinner. She blamed her own scatteredness the first time. She blamed the cleaner the second. The third time she found one earring wedged beneath the baseboard by the cedar closet, a place the earring ought not to have fit, and the way the light hit the pearl made it glint with a wrongness she could not place. She wrote the incident into the ledger because the act of writing fixed things for her. Ink gave shape to suspicion. Entry, 3:22 a.m. Left pearl earring in velvet box. Found earring under baseboard. No footprints. No drafts. Cedar scent strong. Keeping the ledger felt like a domestic sacrament. Emma wrote with the same deliberate hand she used for thank you notes. There was a modest holiness to it. Lines of time and observation, each a bead on a rosary of proof. As the days accumulated, the list moved from casual omissions, missing teaspoons, a misplaced scarf, to things that made her stop mid-motion. Mirrors began to make her uneasy. Not because they reflected her, but because they did not reflect entirely what she felt was on the other side. Once, in the narrow hall that connected the dining room and the study, her reflection lagged by half a breath. She saw the hem of her coat before the rest of her body resolved into the glass. It was the sort of thing people used to write Gothic jokes about, and she told herself aloud that she was being dramatic. The cedar held its breath, indifferent. Noah's absences acquired a new texture. They were not the neglect of lovers who have grown tired, but the practiced disappearances of a man who could be at once tender and itinerant. He would leave mid-conversation with the excuse of a message, a sudden trip to the city, a phone call that always had the right urgency. He returned with a kiss staged for the page. When confronted, he offered explanations as smooth as his hair. A client, a friend, an errand. There was always a smile at the edges, never a tremor that would break his story. Friends, accustomed to the gentle economy of charm, accepted his accounts. They had seen him at parties, had watched him hold a glass and a room together, and they trusted the performance because it was so well made. A lamp began to blink one night, a shallow stuttering that matched the rhythm of her breath. The globe flashed twice, small white blooms, as if it were attempting to record a different light, and then decided to unmake the recording altogether. She was alone, and the effect was small enough to be humiliatingly trivial. She moved to change the bulb, and found that the filament was intact. The electrical had been inspected last month. When she rose with the ladder, the living room seemed to look back at her with a patience that was not human. The cedar grain pulsed like the skin of some sleeping beast. At first, she tested the phenomenon with the usual tools of the modern household. Her phone recorded nothing. She watched the red dot burn like a reassuring ember, and then, at the moment the globe flashed, the screen bloomed into a white nothing. The video file would refuse to play, or it would be a few seconds of ordinary light, and then a blank stream of static that chemical analysis promised would be corruption, inexplicable and mundane. A camcorder she borrowed from an old neighbor, a plastic thing with a clumsy analog charm, produced the same blankness at the critical moment, a brief ring of image and then sterile white. The repeated failures began to outline a pattern. When devices tried to pin the house to evidence, the house seemed to shrug the camera off. Emma told herself she was making too much of accidents. She had cultivated an imagination good enough to dress up any domestic inconvenience into a novel. It helped to have Kem, blunt and unblinking, at her shoulder. Kem had kindness only as a utility. Where the rest of their circle would coo or deflect, Kem asked practical questions and prepared lists. "It's either someone thin enough to get under the couch," Kem said once, hands on hips in the living room, or "it's something in the house," or both. She was precise in the way she spoke about contingency. What could be done in the face of leaking evidence? She suggested analog backups, hard copy notes taped to the underside of tables, battery-powered camcorders, thermal blankets draped across frames. She mocked the white bloom with a laugh that was more a vow. "If your cameras fail, we go old school," Kem declared, extracting a flashlight tin from her bag as if she'd brought a kit for a folk ritual. The first verifiable object arrived like a small, obscene proof. Emma had intended to throw away the trousers she found balled up on the dining room floor. Instead, she discovered a button sewn into the hem, so small and peculiar, it might have been an artisan oddity. It was circular and flat, made of some dark composite that shivered with a faint iridescence when the light hit at certain angles. The surface bore a spiral that, on closer inspection, resembled a pattern of scales. She pressed it to the ledger and wrote until the nib of her pen dug a pale ring into the paper. The act of pressing the button to the page made the evidence she had been collecting suddenly physical, a small coin to be banked. Entry 2:11 a.m. Found button and trousers on dining room floor. Spiral scale motif. Placed in envelope. Scent of cedar stronger at noon. She did not tell anyone at first. There was a brief self-protective logic to secrecy. The fewer witnesses she had, the fewer faces she would have to reconcile with disbelief. But curiosity in Emma's world spread like varnish. News of the button leaked to Kem, who inspected it with a scientist's patience, and then to Ellis, whom she found through a referral and hired because he asked the questions that friends would not. Ellis was pragmatic in the way people become practical when their job is the division between what can be documented and what cannot. He neither scoffed nor indulged. He cataloged. He brought a leather bag full of implements, a field camera, a thermal imager, a collection of analog camcoders, each with annoying labels and colored tape. He listened to Emma with a steady attention that did not ask for melodrama. When she told him about the lamp and the pearl, he wrote down times and conditions, asked about drafts and the house's age, took photographs of the scratches on the skirting board. He took the button with gloves, placed it in a paper envelope, and photographed the scales under magnification. His hands were brusque in the gentle way of professionals who want to leave the world unromanticized. "You write everything down," he said, flipping through the page she offered him. "Times, sounds, temperatures, anything you notice, even if you think it's dumb." He did not smile. He did not make the house into a parable. His neutrality was itself a small comfort. Emma began to schedule vigils. She lit the home in precisely measured bands, lamps in the sitting room, a soft light in the kitchen, a low bulb in the hall, so that the house had no shadow too large for a human eye to encompass. Kem slept over sometimes, making tea in the middle of the night and muttering strategies. They set analog cameras on tripods, aligned 3 at once, then set up a thermal imager Ellis had recommended. There was a ritual to these efforts that felt almost religious. The careful aligning, the ticking of timers, the way they wrote down the start and the end of watches as if they were counting prayers. On the third night of the formal vigil, they finally saw something that did not belong to the mundane list of household misplacements. It was not the clear, complete sight Emma longed for, a cinematic, undeniable monster, but a motion like a suggestion. Under the couch, in the pool of lamplight, a shadow hissed along the floor with a texture that the eye did not expect. A glint, a sheen like the underside of a fish, like a length of something coiling. For a breath the living room held and then expelled air in a collective intake. Kem whispered, sound lost in the padding of rugs. Ellis, fingers poised on a recorder, did not speak. Emma felt the ledger hot against her palm as if ink could anchor what she saw. She moved closer, impulsive as someone who had spent years practice masking composure, and the thing withdrew as if offended by proximity. It was quick, more a suggestion of movement than the movement itself. But she had been trained by the ledger to trust suggestion. She wrote the time down before she let herself breathe. Entry, 1:17 a.m., motion under couch, scale like shimmer, Kem saw. Ellis recorded audio, white bloom on camera at moment of motion, heart loud, cedar smell strong. They slapped the footage onto every machine they had. The digital file showed the room, the red recording dot, then an overexposure of white as if some film had been bleached mid-process. The analog tape, Ellis's backup, ran through and offered a cheap, trembling grain of image, a wavering smear beneath the couch that might have been fabric or light, or a curled sleeve. It defied resolution. The thermal image, taken just after, showed nothing but ordinary body warmth and margins of cool. Forensics, if asked, would later name the discrepancy elegantly. Equipment failure at the critical moment, data corruption, the inevitable shortcomings of recording in domestic spaces. The pattern was beginning to shape itself. No one called it by a name. The habit of naming something gave power. You could close a folder and mark its contents. But the coil, for lack of a better language, rejected nomenclature. It was given gestures instead. The scale-like shimmer, the way the lamp blinked a little when nearby, the spiraled button as if cast off from a garment that did not belong to any one person. Noah, when told about these occurrences in small, staged conversations, smiled in a way that was both solicitous and slightly private. "You're making yourself more nervous than you need to be," he said once, leaning across the kitchen island, 2 wine glasses untouched between them. He praised her for keeping the ledger, a kind thing, the social equivalent of the correct napkin fold, and suggested someone might be playing a prank. He suggested practical steps. Call the landlord, bring in a handyman. His tone implied that the house could be solved the way one solved damp. There was collegiality to his suggestions, a man-of-the-world logic designed to close the worry. He also pressed the palm of his hand to the carved key and listened. It was a private gesture, one she was not sure why she resented, and he caught the resentment in the brief stillness of his face. For a moment, the only moment in which he let gravity into his features, he looked exactly like a man who might hide small truths for the sake of larger comforts. Then his mouth smoothed, and charm returned like a tide. The social world around Emma offered her useful forms of pressure. A dinner invitation that required the kind of grooming panic that makes a person believe in the stabilizing power of parties. A neighbor gossip that arrived with a casserole and a question about sleep patterns. There was no malice in these interactions. They were structured ways of returning someone to a known economy. "Are you sleeping?" her mother asked over lemon tea, pragmatic as always. Her mother's voice had a technician's quality. Remove the source of stress, take temporary leave, stay with me while things settle. Emma chose another option. She refused the tidy solutions, moving, selling the house, staging a public spectacle, because in the ledger she had begun to perform a different economy. The ledger was, in part, a refusal to let others translate her experience for her. It was also, privately, an attempt at authorship, the belief that memory, ordered and precise, could stand when witnesses would not. She wrapped the button in tissue and hid it in a pocket sewn into the underside of a coat she planned never to wear in public. She bought additional locks. She set timers for lights to shift floor patterns through the night. She learned the cadence of the house in the way a musician learns a piece, by staying with it. The failures of technology came to feel like interruptions rather than explanations. The bloom on a camera at the moment of seeing was never random. There was an almost cruel precision to its timing. The red dot would be recording, and then the light would surge and the files would end up white, hollowed by a bloom that was less a glitch than a decision. Each technological collapse made Emma more methodical. If cameras failed, she turned to analog. Written observations taped under tables, bottles of water placed in a line to register tiny displacements, a string tied across thresholds in case a coil dragged itself along a seam. The measures were childish, and they were also tender. She wanted to build a ledger that no one could take apart. There were witnesses who would not call her mad. Kem, who slept in the spare room on a futon and brewed coffee like a ritual, saw enough irregularity to stop laughing. She catalogued things with the brutal optimism of someone who wants to fight rather than explain away. "If something slips," she said one dawn, wiping sleep from her eyes, "then it slips to us. We are not going to let it slip out of memory." Ellis brought a quiet order to their chaos, with a stack of labeled boxes and recorded inventory. They cordoned off the couch with tags and small, official-looking notes. Evidence, do not remove. It made the house feel like a crime scene they were determined to protect from disbelief. Neighbors noticed, of course. Quietly at first, an extra curtain closed against the living room window, a polite knock that asked if Emma was well. A reporter called once on behalf of a lifestyle column and asked, half jocularly, if the house had a particular charm that made it desirable for socialites. There was pressure that came not from malice, but from expectation. People wanted a story that fit into their calendars. Emma felt the edges of her life being nudged into a shape that would be flattering and simple. A gifted house, a charming paramour, a small domestic haunt resolved by a neat reveal. She resisted because the ledger taught her to resist reduction. For a week, nothing overt happened. Then came the morning when the bedroom mirror refused her face. She woke and saw her reflection slant, like a borrowed photograph. The room behind it did not line up properly. The cedar on the dresser diffused into a darker grain in the glass, and she caught herself tracing the seam between the reflection and the room. She pressed her fingertips to the glass and found the surface cool as always. The mirror did not give. It only suggested. She called Ellis and asked for a second opinion. He arrived in overalls and a steady demeanor, carrying the thermal imager as if it were a sedative. They mounted it on a tripod in the bedroom and watched the screen as it translated heat into blooms of color, a human weather map of nighttime. Emma sat on the bed and felt ridiculous and serious in equal measure. The thermal readouts were ordinary: body heat, circulation, the radiator's small warmth across the floor. Nothing extraordinary to the instrument's language. Yet, as the light in the bedroom shifted, soft lamplight, the radiator's dusk, there was the quick suggestion of a different reading along the skirting board. A cool, narrow line that hugged the seam between floor and wall like a secret. "Could be wiring," Ellis suggested. "Could be a draft. Could be—" He stopped mid-sentence because neither of them wanted to fill it. Emma kept the ledger under her pillow that night, the book's heft a talisman. The entries multiplied. Already the ledger had become more than a prose of occurrences. It was becoming a map of her inward attention. She recorded moods as if they were phenomena. The way fear tasted like metallic cedar, the way longing pressed her to tidy and to hold. Her desire for a domestic life with Noah lingered like the scent in the sheets. It made her patient and gullible and brave in strange measures. She wanted to be the woman who had steady buttons, who used the carved key without anxiety. She wanted a house that was not an accusation. Desire in her moved like the coil, present, curling, hard to pin down. Noah's presence in that desire complicated everything. He could be, with astonishing fidelity, exactly what she wanted. He sent notes that read like small prayers for permanence, an offer to host a dinner in the new dining room, a photograph taken in the foyer with a caption about the house's charm. His charm worked like a social solvent. It smoothed corners and made his absences less of an absence. Yet in private, when she asked simple questions, about a time he had not returned a call, about the provenance of a certain scent on a scarf, he answered in ways that were close to evasions. He did not lie outright. He offered plausible omissions. There were evenings when she speculated on cruelty. the idea that he might be orchestrating her worry like a subtle, private theater. It made the world small then, pinched into the size of a stage. But it also failed to match the evidence she catalogued. None of the missing jewelry, none of the lamp's blinks, none of the button's black spiral fit into the neat architecture of a prank. The phenomenon had the patience of something older than performance. It appeared and withdrew with intervals that did not map to his comings and goings. The coil, if it could be called such, had an independence she could not blame on appetite or duplicity. She tried once to catch his attention with gentleness. At dinner, she slid the ledger onto the table between them, opened to a page where the ink lay wet with her last entry. "I'm keeping records," she said. The room hummed with the low sound of their neighbors' dishwashers, and the candlelight turned Noah's chin into model clay. He smiled as if the ledger were the most charming of ornaments. "That's sensible," he said. He reached out to touch the paper, but his fingers hovered, not quite pressing down. "We can sort this out, Em. You know I'll help." It was not a refusal. It was not a confession, either. It was the slim compromise that people who love being liked extend to serious issues, words that comfort without setting the world on fire. Emma did not want flames. She wanted a lock to latch cleanly and stay latched. Yet, even as she clung to the idea of a tidy domestic life, she felt the ledger shape her in another direction. The act of keeping witness was changing her from a person who accepted the explanations of others to someone who would keep truth by her own hand. That week, the house provided another fragment. Under the chaise lounge in the study, tucked into the seam of the cushion, was a tiny spool of thread, wound with a filament that glittered like ichor. It matched the button's spiral in its suggestion of scale. She photographed it, handled it with gloves, and placed it beside the first envelope. The two objects looked mischievous together, like proof that whatever had come into her life had also been attentive to details. Kem suggested they set a live watch in the dining room and stream nothing, an odd discipline of silence. They placed the analog camera where it could see the floor beneath the couch and left the room's lights even, the lamp steady as a sentry. Ellis sat in the kitchen with his back to the door, reading a book but watching the screen when he thought Emma was not looking. For once the house behaved. The night moved on with the regularity of the city's distant sirens. Emma began to think she had been punished by her attention. Then, at 1:17 a.m., the living room changed as if someone had inhaled sharply. The lamp flashed its opaque globe twice, quick as a blink, and the analog camera, taped with Ellis's blue label, showed a wavering smear under the couch before the frame melted into white. The white was obscene in its clarity, like a silence that had teeth. The thermal imager, engaged by Ellis's careful hand, registered a brief cold line that creased the floor like a seam of frost. It lasted 15 seconds, and then the thermal returned to its ordinary palette. Ellis rewound the tape until his knuckles hurt, but the camera had done its work and the bloom had bled the image away. Kem swore softly. Emma held the ledger in both hands and wrote until her pen splintered. The room smelled of cedar, coffee, and something metallic that did not have a name. For a moment, she allowed herself the vanity of thinking, "This is the moment we will show them. This will be the page where everyone starts to believe." Like all moments designed for the public, it resisted performance. When they took the tape to the technician Ellis recommended, a small lab run by a woman who had once worked in documentary film, the response was measured and patient. The technician set the tape in a player with white gloves and watched. She ran the footage frame by frame and then shook her head. "There's a bloom," she said. "Some kind of overexposure, it happens. The tape degrades when it's exposed to static. It's impossible to say if anything was there. I can clean up the edges, but you'll be left with a smear." Ellis asked gently for a written statement. The lab provided terms and a bill. They printed a report that used the neutral language of technicians: data corruption, exposure anomaly, insufficient resolution. The report was not dismissive. It simply refused to commit to the presence of anything supernormal. It treated the white bloom the way bureaucracy treats a fog, a thing that can be noted and placed on a form, but not necessarily interpreted. Emma took the report home and placed it under the edge of the ledger like a counterweight. She read it over and over, making marginalia in pencil that no one would see. The house felt larger and lonelier at once. The reporting traced the outline of a gulf she could not cross with paperwork. Her desire for a neat social remedy, evidence that would produce the same public acknowledgement as a charity gala, clashed with the stubborn opacity of reality. When she told Noah about the lab's statement, he listened without theatricality. Sometimes his face gave up slight things, an eyebrow lift, a curled smile, but his response was practical. A suggestion of more attempts, better cameras, a hire of specialists who might understand obscure tape artifacts. He offered emotional ballast, affectionate hands that smoothed her sleeves, an offer to host another dinner to keep the social machine running. His willingness to play the supporting role in her crisis comforted her. It also made her wonder if his comfort was designed to preserve the life they had been drafting together, rather than to discover truth. There were nights when she dreamed of watching the coil retract across the floor and choosing to stand and follow it. Those dreams were not cinematic chases. They were small acts of companionship. Her hand nearly touching a curl of scale, the coiling answering and then withdrawing like a cat that might yet accept the tenderness. Desire, when it met impossibility, did not erupt into melodrama. It nodded internally into complex compromises. Emma wanted the thing gone, but she also wanted irrationally the intimacy of someone who could know her house in the way the coil seemed to, except she did not want to be considered gullible for imagining such knowledge. Her social sphere condensed into a handful of practical witnesses. Kem maintained the live watch schedule with an almost military devotion. Ellis took to sleeping in his car and returning at odd hours to check for anomalies. Her mother offered to take her away for a week, which felt like an exile. Emma refused, not because she thought herself brave, but because she was not sure that distance would help. The ledger had become a line connecting dots. Leaving would render the line useless. One morning she found a note folded beneath the carved key on the hall table. The handwriting was not Noah's nor hers. The paper was thin, the ink faded, and it bore only a single sentence: "Keep your ledger." A smaller secondary mark, a spiral scratched with the tip of a pen, sat in the margin like a signature. She did not know if it was kindness or cruelty. She slid the note into the ledger between pages and left the house with the key heavy in her palm, a physical weight to balance the ache in her chest. The days acquired a new economy of small checks and rituals. She would run the vacuum along the skirting boards and then inspect the dust for displaced fibers. She kept a small envelope of salt in a drawer, a ridiculous talisman, and she would sprinkle a grain across thresholds to watch for disturbance. She stopped wearing certain coats in public because their pockets seemed to attract unaccounted items. She began to sleep with the ledger on her nightstand and a single ponytail of cedar bark beneath her pillow like some awkward charm. Noah's public face continued to be the face that saved any situation from unraveling. At a brunch held in the house to introduce certain friends to their new domestic stage, he toasted with a confidence that moved the room like a seasonable breeze. He owned the house in the light in a way he did not in private. That afternoon, a neighbor's child pressed her face against the bay window and whispered to Emma that something funny had been in the garden. The child's eyes were sincere, and for a sliver of a moment, Emma imagined a public story forming at the edges. Small haunt in Socialite's garden. Charming boyfriend stands by. Investigatory drama makes rounds. She felt an old, humiliation-based fear that the story would settle her into a pattern she had spent years avoiding. Instead, she let the ledger hold the story. She recorded witnesses who mattered to her and left the rest of the world to make up its mind. The ledger became a private scripture, a set of entries that, if read together, might one day form a convincing liturgy of truth. It was not legal proof. It was not even sociological evidence. It was a testimony penned in the handwriting of someone who had learned to trust her own notice over the judgments of others. By the time Ellis recommended a specialist, someone who had worked on sets and with analog film and who treated tape as a medium with moods, Emma had stopped expecting miracles. She had learned that the coil existed in a seam of things, between light and white, between camera and film, between social acceptance and personal testimony. She could not name it, nor could she be sure what it wanted. All she knew was that with each item she banked in envelopes, and with each line she wrote in the ledger, She was choosing a life that required endurance rather than a tidy closure. On a late, humid night, they set a different kind of watch. Ellis had convinced a tech to come in with a modified analog array, redundant power sources, separate isolated cameras, an unbroken tape loop, and Kem had organized a roster of watchers. Emma sat in the living room in a cardigan that smelled faintly of cedar and watched the lamps breathe. Noel, a florist from down the lane who had no deeper involvement than a curiosity over houseplants, stood by the doorway and tried to be useful. The house felt like a machine wound, slow and fragile, and Emma felt like its keeper. At 1:17 a.m., precisely, the living room changed its temperature like a throat clearing. The lamp globes winked one after the other, and in the space between light, there was the vague impression of a length uncoiling along the skirting board. Kem, with a torch held flat along the floor, saw the same shimmer Emma had seen weeks before. They watched as if a small miracle had been pressured into obedience. This time, the analog array captured something that resisted annulling. It was not a portrait of a creature. It was something less satisfying and more infuriating. The thermal camera registered a cool line tracing the floor in slow motion, and one analog camera, whose battery had been taped in a last-minute redundancy, offered a 15-second grainy loop that suggested structure. A curling, a sheen, the way scales would catch light. When they rewound the tape, they found a single frame where the smear resolved into something like a ring of scales pressed flat against the floor. It was enough to make the heart jump and to make rational hands clutch. They took the spool to the lab with the same cautious hope as before. The technician this time kept her face as unreadable as always, but sat in the dark room longer, peering into the footage with a patience that bordered on hunger. She ran the film, rewound it, and then said, "This one's better. There's patterning in the grain." She did not say yes. She did not promise the world. She offered them a cleaned copy for a fee, and a note that any restoration would, by virtue of the process, introduce artifacts. The language was cautious because the world had a place for caution. For a delicious hour afterward, Emma allowed herself the vanity of victory. The ledger filled as if warmed by the new detail. The entries took on a writing that felt like relief, precise, factual, less lyrical than before. She noted the time, the people present, the equipment used, the sensations. The button's spiral pattern seemed to drum at the edges of her perception like a small sea sound. Her desire, a home tied to her by something more durable than parties, felt momentarily validated. And then the public machinery started to whir. Someone on social media, a friend of a friend who had heard of the late-night watch, began to craft a rumor. It was polite at first, infused with a certain curiosity that turned quickly into commentary. Photos of the house, of the carved key, of Noah smiling under the foyer light, circulated with captions that made mysteries into theater. There was pressure again. Journalists, nosy neighbors, acquaintances keen to know if this was a hoax or a human drama. Emma felt the ledger tremble in her hands as if to remind her of her pact. The more public the story, the greater the risk that the thing that had appeared to her would retreat under the light and refuse to be seen. She also noticed an internal movement. Her desire for the house, the part that wanted keys to turn without question and candles to burn with predictable warmth, wanted the validation that the tape promised to provide. The more the public colonized her private events, the more tempting it became to produce the proof that would bring her life back into its smooth channels. Noah, who had always been useful at making her feel that life could be easy again, urged subtle caution. He suggested bringing in a science-style team, people whose credentials shone like polished coins. He smiled when he said it in a manner that implied competence. Emma understood his impulse. She also felt the ledger's contrary insistence that the truth she would live by did not require a public coronation. It required the quiet endurance of someone willing to be alone as a witness. The ledger was not a bargaining chip to be waved in public. It was the slow work of memory. She placed the cleaned copy of the tape in the cedar bread box for safekeeping, and instead slid the physical button into her coat's secret pocket, where it warmed to the skin. In the hush of another night, the house seemed to settle as if it had been holding its breath for too long. She stood in front of the mirror and watched her reflection, whose outline refused to smile entirely. The cedar behind her radiated its faint heat. She pressed her palm to the carved key on the hall table, a small, private liturgy, and felt the metal cool under her skin. Desire met impossible not as a single sizzling moment of revelation, but as a long, intimate negotiation reached by slow concessions. She had been given a house and a man and an expectation. She had also been granted a seam that ran between waking things. When she wrote the next ledger entry, the ink trembled less than before. Entry, 2:03 a.m. Analog capture better quality. Thermal shows cool seam along skirting. Forensics report expected. Noah present, but restrained. Chest tight. Intend to be my witness. She folded the ledger closed and slid it into the bedside drawer beneath the cedar sachet. The drawer was where she kept small certainties. A list of passwords. A photograph of her mother when she was young. The note with the spiral scribble. The house exhaled with the scent of cedar as if approving the arrangement. Outside, the city breathed in a rain-slick night. Inside, Emma lay awake with the ledger under her hand like a pulse. She thought about the ways public life demanded tidy narratives and how often those narratives erased the complexity of ordinary longing. She wanted steadiness, not chaos, not spectacle. She wanted the right to choose how to carry a truth that other people might find inconvenient. The ledger was not proof in any courtly sense. It was a manner of keeping company with herself. In the small hours, somewhere beneath the bed, the house made a sound as if a fabric had shifted. It could have been settling. It could have been a misaligned board. It could have been the coil. She did not leap up. She folded the sheet of paper where she'd written the last entry and slid it into the pocket beneath the lining of her coat. She put the carved key back in its bowl, then took it out again, feeling the scales under her thumb like a miniature topography. She did not want to become a woman defined by a house that could not be explained. She also did not want to relinquish the reality of what she had seen. So she made a choice whose bravado was mostly private. She would be the first and last witness to the life within her walls. She would not court spectacle because spectacle demanded a story with a beginning and an end. She would live instead with margins and care. Her desire, so quietly fierce, met something that refused to be pinned. The ledger would be her concord, the button her talisman, the key her contract. When dawn came, the lamp globes dulled and the cedar softened into daylight. She dressed in a blouse that smelled faintly of a summer that had not yet occurred and opened the front door to a courier with a packet of papers, an estimate from the forensics lab for a detailed report, a social columnist's polite inquiry, a note from Noah asking if she would have dinner. She folded the forensics estimate into the ledger and wrote a new line. Consider costs, consider public exposure, consider the house as my altar. A sound at Ehe. A sound at the edge of sleep, an almost domestic scrape, like a shoe finding a new seam, made the house seem suddenly older than it had when she'd first passed the threshold. Emma held the ledger under her hand until the book's weight matched the pulse in her wrist. She rose with the practiced economy of someone who lived among objects and habits, not dramatics. The carved key lay warm in its bowl. She felt for it as if for courage. In the hall, a courier waited with a large envelope whose flap was stamped with the lab's crest. The forensics estimate rustled like a dry leaf as she opened it. The fee was more than she had expected, the turnaround time longer than she would have liked. There was a polite note tucked inside, language that tried to be comforting while promising nothing. Equipment subject to typical degradation, any restoration could introduce artifacts, a tentative suggestion of an expert consultation at further cost. The letter read like a map that ended at an empty field. She folded the estimate into the ledger and wrote on a new line the same few words she had been practicing aloud in the quiet hours. Consider costs, consider public exposure, consider the house as my altar. It felt, absurdly, like liturgy. If you love slow-burning, haunting romances, subscribe for more. It was an almost invisible action. An aside the house did not register, and then the day reclaimed itself. Phone calls about fashion fittings, a rescheduled lunch, the dull social friction of small talk. But the ledger sat taut under her chair like a promise. She carried it through the day in a tote with a cedar sachet tucked into its seam, and it hummed against her hip as if it were a living thing that required care. That afternoon brought a delegation of sorts. a reporter from a magazine that specialized in the domestic lives of the socially visible, an officious woman with sharply folded glasses who had the air of a person for whom stories were always serviceable. She asked questions that were both routine and sly. Had Emma ever considered the symbolic value of a house like this? Had she and Noah discussed plans? Did she think family history might explain anything? The questions were polite enough to conceal their ammunition. Emma answered, keeping the ledger from showing on the table. Noah, who arrived later and greeted the reporter with an impeccable smile, appeared to stabilize the room. He toasted casually, his fingers finding the bowl with the key as if by habit, and for a moment Emma felt the familiar current of desire. A life with someone who could make the world tilt less often. The reporter left with a brief handshake and the promise of an editorial visit. Within 48 hours, the story, light, curiously intimate, circulated through feeds and group chats. Someone had taken the photos Noah had posed for and framed them next to a close-up of the carved key on Emma's hall table. The comment threads proliferated the way small, bright things do in sunlight. Curiosity, skepticism, a few speculative threads about hoaxes. The more public the story became, the more delicate the seam between the domestic and the unreal felt to Emma. The ledger, which had been private scripture, suddenly seemed to thrum like an exposed wire. Every friend who messaged with the neutral charm of condolence made her feel as if she were balancing on a very small stage. The police were called a week later, not because anyone had accused her of wrongdoing, but because a passerby, an accountant who walked his dog past her home each morning, spotted a late-night cluster of people and assumed something worth reporting. Protocol folded its measured pace around Emma's life. Officers arrived in uniforms that smelled faintly of coffee and vinyl. They accepted a statement and photographed the living room where tags remained taped like small official petals labeling what each person had touched. The gesture was clinical. It was also a kind of recognition. Someone had come to document what she had already been keeping. They took the button in a paper bag and logged it under an incident number. A polite detective, careful and not unkind, asked standard questions: sleep habits, medication, anyone who might have interest in playing a prank, a history of domestic disputes. He asked about family, about debt, things that were the shape of routine care for a person whose reality lay partly out of view. Emma answered with the ledger at her side, and with the practiced calm of someone who had been learning to translate her interior life into sentences. The detective placed the paper evidence in a file and promised to have an officer follow up if anything else came in. The moment bore no malice. It was bureaucratic attention, small and steady as a metronome. Forensics came with sterile bags and efficient hands. They photographed the thread spool and the button with a professional distance that could have been mistaken for disinterest. The technician who examined the analog tape from the better capture wore a face that suggested concentration, but not hope. Her report would use the language Emma had come to recognize: exposure anomaly, insufficient resolution, chain of custody concerns. They logged the thermal data and noted ambient interference. There were, as always, plausible technical causes. There were, as always, openings for doubt. The lab's monetary estimate and the police's neutrally worded conclusion pushed Emma toward decisions she had not wanted: pay for professional restoration, or let a private ledger remain the only repository of her testimony. Noah watched her weighing the cost of a public attempt to secure proof against the cost of privacy. He did not urge spectacle. When she suggested, once, an op-ed, an article in which she might frame the experience as an oddity that intersected with modern living, he offered to help draft it with a tone that would placate the public and preserve her dignity. He proposed a narrative that would secure her social position: a woman gently tested by a house, a charming lover who stood by, experts who cleared things up. To Emma, this sounded like a table set for the world's appetite for tidy arcs. She refused the article, refused not out of stubbornness, but because she recognized the ledger's shape. The ledger did not require a readership, it required fidelity. The act of writing tightened her witness into something unpurchasable. She told Noah she would pay for a partial restoration, a conservative cleaning that would not promise miracles, but might show whether the grain held anything beyond artifact. He put his hand over hers and, in the half-dark of the kitchen, pressed the carved key to his ear again as if listening for a second sound. His expression fractured for a moment, small fissures that made her imagine other rooms he might enter when he disappeared from their public life. But then he smoothed into the social face she had come to rely on. The pressure of other people's expectations arranged itself around Emma like weather. Invitations thinned into a line of polite pauses. Some friends disappeared with the gentle shame of not knowing what to do with someone who would not be reduced to a simple story. Others, more practical, offered help. Kem insisted on a new surveillance design with redundancies, a dollhouse of wires and analog cams, batteries and manual film. Ellis scoured contacts for an archivist who specialized in analog restoration and who had, by reputation, a stubborn aversion to definitive verdicts. He recommended patience the way a carpenter recommends an extra measure of timber. The house, for its part, resumed its habit of small rebellions. Mirrors kept their secrets in the way a door keeps a draft. Lamps blinked like breaths. The carved key, safe in its bowl, was occasionally touched by someone who had no reason to know its scale. Mail arrived with more notes, sometimes encouraging, sometimes anonymous. Once there was a business card slipped under the door from someone who claimed to have seen similar things. No contact number, just a single word underlined twice. Notice. Emma tucked such trifles into the ledger between entries, a stack of irritants that became a palimpsest of attention. A few weeks later, an evening vigil convened that felt less like investigation and more like a communion. The house held its breath while a small congregation, Kem, Ellis, Noah, a level-headed neighbor named Laya who produced sandwiches as if ritual feeding could steady any crisis, sat in a ring of lamplight. They attempted to rehearse restraint. No sudden movements, no laughter that might be taken as performance, no devices projecting image that would then be reduced to white blooms. They opted for analog, for the hum of tape, for the earnest slowness of old film. It was, for Emma, oddly intimate to have witnesses in the room, whose presence meant the ledger could be corroborated not by data, but by embodied memory. She had never wanted a crowd. She wanted a few careful friends who would pause their lives and remember things the way she remembered them. The watchers agreed to keep their testimony honest, speak if you saw it, refuse to dramatize, mark times carefully. At 1:17 a.m., the lamp did what lamps had done before. It blinked. The room inhaled. Something moved like a thought across the skirting board, a suggestion of scale catching the lamplight in a way that made the breath in the room hitch. For a meager, furious instant, the analog camera held an image. Not the whole of the thing, never the whole, but a ring, a flattened coil that lay like an emblem against the floor. It was a frame that made a shock travel up spines. They took the film to a different lab this time, a place that dealt in restoration for art house cinema, and in the temperamental loyalties of archivists. The technician there was sympathetic in a way that felt like complicity. She loved objects for their stubborn refusal to be reduced. She did not promise more than she could do. But when she turned the spool under a careful light and let the film speak, she uttered a single small phrase. "There is patterning here." They cheered in the car as if they were children who had found a small treasure. Emma let it wash through her the way a warm tide might wash through tired feet. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that the coil might be annexed into the public ledger, that the world might take its place among other knowable things. The feeling was intoxicating and dangerous. It felt, in its sweetness, like being considered whole by strangers. It did not last. When the cleaned copy was circulated among the people who mattered, Emma's circle, Noah's acquaintances, a scientist of some repute who agreed to a private viewing, the response was again patient and neutral. The image, the scientist said, contained patterning but could not be called definitive. The lab's analysis, appended to the small report, included all the possible technical explanations a conscientious person could imagine. Latent exposure, emulsion artifacts, compression introduced by digital transfer. The words were not dismissive. They were careful, which is often the same thing. The public found reasons to be both hungry and content. Social feeds blossomed with think pieces about the eroticism of mystery, articles that waxed about how modern living made room for the uncanny. Opinions split between those who wanted a reveal and those who found the very ambiguity delicious. Noah's name circulated with the same equivocal warmth he had brought into Emma's life. At a benefit dinner a few nights later, he stood under low chandeliers and made remarks that smoothed conversation into agreeable shapes. Emma sat at the same table and felt the ledger in her coat, a reassuring weight. She did not speak of the coil at that party. She let his presence do a work for her that neither proof nor denunciation could replace. But the coil did not respect social calendars. It claimed small intimacies. A pearl earring slipped from a necklace and found beneath a sofa cushion that had been sat upon by other guests. A camera left on a tripod that recorded a white bloom in the middle of a toast. A hallway mirror that reflected a shoulder where a face should have been. Each incident tightened the noose of attention around Emma's private life, turning household annoyances into proof requests she could not answer to everyone's satisfaction. There were moments when she felt very clearly the shape of a choice. To stage a public viewing that might finally pin the coil to a visible body, or to live with the house and its seam in private, tending its ledger like someone tending a small, stubborn flame. The first option promised validation of a kind that the world understood, a cinematic reveal, headlines, late-night talk shows. The second offered something less immediately satisfying. Endurance, the right to one's own testimony, quietness. Emma weighed them often and found that both held seduction. The first would return her to social smoothness. The second would make her a person who could move through life without always deferring to the public verdict. Kem pushed for the public option. She had no taste for the half measure of private memory. "You have enough," she said one night, arms folded around a mug. "You don't need the world's permission to live in your own house, but if you want it, if you want them to stop insinuating you're making this up, you have to give them the thing they'll understand. A live stream with enough cameras, press, make it undeniable." Ellis, more cautious, argued that the cost of spectacle might be higher than the comfort of vindication. In his times of tired candor, he would say that proof is always partially performance. The presence of witnesses changes what happens. He worried that the coil might learn to hide more deftly under the glare, like animals who go quiet when hunters approach with torchlight. "There's no guarantee," he said simply. "And if the footage fails again, you'll have put yourself in a pressure cooker with people who won't forgive failure." Her mother offered a third path, a temporary exile under the name of self-care. Leave the house, let professionals work in your absence, return when the work is done. "It's simpler," she said over tea, pragmatic and precise. "If it's something in the house, leave. If it's not, you'll have rested." Emma understood the logic. Of course she did, but it felt like betrayal of the ledger's first principle. Removal slit the line of continuity her entries formed. If she left, then the ledger would be evidence of a life abandoned rather than a life endured. The decision, when it came, was not theatrical. It arrived as a set of small choices made across several mornings, not to go public, not to flee, but to anchor. She added more locks, yes, and installed a manual bolt that required 2 hands to unsettle. She built a small pocket in her coat where the button lay like a private coin. She told Noah, not as confrontation but as boundary, that she would not turn her home into a spectacle. He listened. He did not argue. In his eyes there was something that looked like disappointment and something that looked like respect. It was impossible to know which was stronger. A vigil organized with more formality than they had attempted before gathered neighbors, friends, and a local historian who had an interest in old houses. The organizers insisted on an independent mediator to record testimony in written form, someone whose notes might stand up to the curious scrutiny of strangers. The night was humid, and the cedar diffused a soft perfume like a memory of warmth. The lamps held steady, batteries checked and double-checked. Cameras sat obedient on tripods like waiting animals. At the heart of the vigil, in the living room where the skirting board had learned to host the coil's passage, a small clear space was left. The watchers sat in chairs with notepads, some in a deferential silence as if in a chapel. They had come less to witness forensics than to bear witness to a woman who had chosen to stay. It was, in its way, the opposite of spectacle, a ceremony of refusal. The motion came as it always did. A small shifting at the edge of lamplight, the lamp globes breathing like lungs. It uncoiled with a grace that had nothing to do with malice and everything to do with habit. People gasped, voices starting into phrases they could not finish. One of the cameras, the one with the redundant manual battery that Ellis had insisted upon, captured a grainy loop in which a sheen unrolled like a flag pressed to the floor. The thermal imager picked up briefly a cool trace that hugged the seam between skirting and board like an old scar. For 15 seconds, reality made itself known in the way it had before. Partial, maddening, intimate. And then the white bloom came. It was precise as a conclusion. The red recording dots still glowed. The footage, when played back, offered a trembling ring of scales in a single frame, and then a miraculous, thorough white that devoured the rest. The live witnesses, present in the room and certain by virtue of being present, had memory, smell, a sense of temperature, and the ledger's entries. But the external certainties, the film, the grain, the proof that could go from living room to court of public opinion, had betrayed them again. Instruments that had been prepared with ritual care collapsed into their habitual failure. Police were called by someone who wanted an official record. They arrived with calm efficiency and took statements. Forensics took the tapes and made their notes. The technician wrote in neutral tone, "Exposure anomaly, film degradation, no additional physical traces aside from ordinary dust and fibers." The paperwork leaned, as it always had, toward plausible deniability. The investigator who wrote the report was not unkind. He offered phrases that showed curiosity and a lack of eagerness to ridicule. Still, the report would be incorporated into a file that would hold the coil as a footnote, an incident, rather than as a phenomenon deserving of a new category. Emma felt the ledger vibrate under her hand like a heartbeat. She could have stood in the center of her living room and read every entry aloud to those assembled, called journalists, demanded an airing. She could have mounted the cleaned reel on a projector and invited the public to see the frame where the scales seemed to press flat against the floor. The temptation to demand a unanimous belief was exquisite. It would have given her a public life restored to balance. She did not. Instead, she chose to preserve her space. She decided to let the ledger be what it had become, her compact with memory. She refused to make noise because noise asked of her a story she did not have the right to craft out of halves. She would not barter her private truth for the ephemeral comfort of public agreement. The decision felt like a small, stubborn sovereignty. Noah, who had attended the vigil, and who had offered practical suggestions without insisting on them, kissed the back of her hand at the doorway after the police left. The gesture was quiet, private, as if he were availing himself of the intimacy that had always been his to borrow. They did not argue. There was no confession, no accusation. His face retained the composure of a man practiced in the grammar of charm. It also, beneath its smoothness, held lines that suggested regions she did not enter. She slept that night with the ledger at her side and the button in its secret pocket, and she dreamed not of dramatic resolutions but of slow, domestic continuities. The kettle boiling at the right time, a lamp that remained stead, a man who could be relied upon to show up when he said he would. Desire, which had brought her the house and softened her life in 1,000 small ways, remained a tender pressure in her chest. It had not been annihilated by the coil. It had been complicated. The impossible had entered her domesticity and refused integration. It occupied a seam she could live beside but not stitch closed. Weeks became months. The press cooled. Humans grow bored of mysteries that do not mutate into spectacle. The coils of commentary unwound until they became thin threads again. Emma's social life rearranged itself around the ledger's existence. Friends who stayed did so with the kind of loyalty that had little to do with curiosity and more to do with faithful presence. Kem took to Wednesday nights as a permanent fixture. Ellis continued his scheduled visits and introduced a methodical inventory that made the house feel guarded against the forgetfulness of the world. Emma's mother visited less as inspector than as companion. She brought a tin of lemon cake and sat on the edge of the sofa, hands folded, listening to Emma read aloud from the ledger, as if to a small congregation. The ledger had a way of making testimony gentle. Lines of time, small factual sentences that functioned as anchors. Emma read entries that cataloged the way the cedar smelled at dawn, the times a lamp blinked, the precise hours when the coil seemed bolder. Her mother's silence was practical. She did not offer explanations. She offered instead to thread the needle when sewing up a coat pocket where the button might hide, or to hold the spoon steady when it trembled with reaction. Noah, who remained a presence in her life, though his appearances were less constant than the public presumed, was not banished. They continued to meet, sometimes for dinners at her table, sometimes on neutral ground. Their intimacies were small and tender, an offered scarf, a shared joke about wallpaper. He remained ambiguous in the way the DNA had insisted, warm and suave, and capable of an intimacy that felt practiced, a man who could be present and at the same time preserve a private distance that Emma could not fully measure. There were times when she suspected him of deceptions that would have made him a minor villain in another story. There were times when he held her hand with a softness that made the ledger's solemn columns seem less lonely. Ambiguity, in their relationship, became its own moral discipline. The ledger, once a private act of survival, turned into a domestic ritual. She would write at dawn and at night, not always to record phenomena, but to record the work of living. What she had eaten, small notes about visitors, and the oddities that still occurred. Mirrors that misaligned their reflections by the breadth of a breath, lamps that blinked like answered prayers, and the occasional discovery of a small article, a thread spool, a pearl, the faint scent of cedar where no wood had been placed. The entries became less frantic, more like a map drawn by someone intent upon not losing her bearings. On a late autumn morning, as the house smelled faintly of cedar and roast coffee, Emma stood in front of the bedroom mirror and watched her reflection with the attention of someone who had learned to be precise. The glass returned a face that was complete and incomplete at once. Her eyes, the faint line at the corner of her mouth, the way her hair lay, these were ordinary facts. And yet at the margin of the reflection, there was a slippage, an off-register echo like the memory of a note after a song ends. She pressed her palm to the frame, feeling the cool of the glass under the warmth of her skin, and she did something that had not been a certainty for months. She opened the ledger and wrote the line she had rehearsed for so long. I will be my own witness. The vow settled in her the way a vow does, not magic, but margin. It did not make the coil visible to other people, nor did it give the lab something it had refused. It changed the terms of her authority. She stopped expecting external absolution and accepted the work of being faithful to her own perception. The ledger, the button, the carved key. These objects remained as relics of contact between desire and impossibility. They were not trophies, but instruments of keeping. Months later, in the house's quieter hours, a neighbor would cross her path on the stair and murmur about how the windows looked brighter lately, or how the scent of cedar had become a signature one might associate with the place. Laya, who tended the small bay garden, would occasionally mention finding curious, scale-like markings on the underside of a leaf, as if whatever moved had left a trace that did not belong in ordinary botany. The markings were small and would be easily explained away by anyone who wished to do so. Emma nevertheless pressed them into the ledger and closed the book with a soft, satisfied sound. The coil did not vanish. It continued to make its appearances, sometimes a suggestion under a couch, sometimes a long absence that felt like patience, always partial, never named. It behaved like a presence that respected boundaries as much as it defied them. It had not been conquered, nor had it been domesticated. It persisted as a seam between worlds Emma could not articulate. Her desire for a steady domestic life remained, threaded with an acceptance that steadiness might mean learning to live with something one could not fully control. There were nights when she imagined an ending in which the coil became visible enough to be litigated and photographed and made into stories that would sell. There were nights when she imagined a different ending, where Noah would confess an indulgent cruelty, a prank played over months to test the sincerity of the woman who loved him. Neither ending occurred. Instead, there was settlement, a life that continued with boundaries and rituals, with a ledger that chronicled the work of paying attention. On a winter evening, after a small storm had swept the city free of its humid residue, Emma set the carved key into the bowl and left it there for a long time, watching the brass catch the light. She opened the ledger and turned to the first pages, reading the earliest entries about the first missing earring, the first lamp blink. The house smelled of cedar and a faint dust of rain. She closed the book, slid the button into its secret pocket, and turned off the hall light. In the bedroom mirror, Her reflection looked back with the same slight delay she had once feared. She met that off-register glance and did not flinch. She had wanted once a place that would tidy the dissonant pieces of her life into a readable whole. What she had been given was a house that held aberration like a neighbor's stray cat, present, sometimes intrusive, rarely explained. Desire had met the impossible and had not been annihilated. It had been complicated, rearranged into a stoic tenderness. She kept the ledger as witness. She kept the button like a quiet charm. She kept the carved key as the contract between her need and whatever would intrude into domestic life. In the end, she learned to live along the seam. She learned that some truths required stewardship more than spectacle. She learned that witnesses could be private and faithful, and that a life of small, deliberate choices could be as strong as any public vindication. The romance, the strange gravity that had drawn her to Noah and to the promise of a cedar house, remained a part of her life, haunted by possibility and by the coil's occasional shimmer. It did not end in a revelation, nor in a neat depravity's exposure. It ended, if endings can be so modest, in a continuing. A woman who would be her own first and last witness, who would write the ledger's lines as long as she lived, who would lock the key into its bowl and sometimes place a palm against the mirror to see how close her reflection dared to come. When she wrote the last line of a long evening, it was simple and certain. I will be my own witness. She closed the ledger and placed it beneath the cedar sachet, feeling its weight steady the bed. The lamp blinked once, small and private, the house's habitual breath, and the room settled into the measured quiet that belonged to keepers of secrets who refused the murmur of public curiosity. If you have a theory about what the coil might mean, leave it in the comments and subscribe to follow more slow-burning tales like this one.